Dear Professor Chomsky, many thanks for granting us this opportunity. This is also very personal to me. I mean, you won't remember it, but we briefly met actually right after your lecture in Brussels in 1992, almost to the day 30 years ago. I handed you a letter with some remarks on several matters, one of them being, sorry, about King Leopold II. We had a correspondence for a number of years. Now we will get into Leopold II, our common acquaintance, later on. Basically, I would like to hear your opinion on 5 topics. One, the most obvious one, Ukraine. Second, some remarks on Palestine. Then third, go into this issue, this problem of mass shootings in the United States. And then talk a bit about the idea of Belgian federalism as a possible model for a way out in Ukraine. And then as a final subject, go back to Leopold II and decolonization in Belgium after Black Lives Matter for the last years. Now, what I will do is I will elaborate a bit on each question for a minute or so, and then let you talk as you see fit on the subject. If I need to intervene, which I will limit as much as possible, I will raise my hand. So let's start with the most obvious topic of the day, Ukraine, the Russian invasion and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Where do we go from here? The peace movement, and when I say the peace movement, of course, I say that as concision. It's of course more complex. Anyway, the peace movement in Europe is a bit, how would I say, rudderless for the moment. This is definitely not 2003 and the big rallies before the war against Iraq. Some joined the NATO narrative, some joined the Russian version, but most take a stand that I would summarize as no to Putin, no to NATO, for a negotiated ceasefire and basically mutual concessions in some form to be decided. Now, mainstream media here are entirely on the side of NATO. There are some dissidents, a few random academics, who get a lot of flack, but none other than Belgian former politician and former NATO Secretary General Willy Klaas has stated on national TV that the US is exacerbating the war with its unilateral approach. He doesn't say that out of some principled pacifism. He is actually outraged that the US is completely sidetracking the EU while making a bundle in weapon sales and gas deliveries to Europe. What are we to do? Mainstream media offer no context, no history. And my question to you, what are we to do? Can alternative media like what we are play a role in bringing the other narrative? What can you advise?
Well, as to what you can do to reach the public, you know more than I do, so I won't say anything about it. But as to what should be done and what position Europe and the United States should be taking, I think there's a lot to say. We can start with a truism, which nobody can deny. Either the war will be ended by some kind of diplomatic settlement, or it will not. No argument about that. A diplomatic settlement means that each side tolerates it. That's, they don't get what they want, but they can live with it. That's the nature of a diplomatic settlement. So we don't have to debate that. So the choices are either reach a settlement that both sides can tolerate or not. Not means letting the war continue with all the agony that it causes, both in Ukraine and for the world, because the effects are far broader, or one side capitulates. Those are the choices. Well, official US policy is to block a diplomatic settlement. That has been true for years. It is explicit now. Was made even more explicit at the meeting a couple of days ago at the Ramstein Air Base, where the United States called the NATO powers and others together to hear official US policy, which is NATO policy. US basically runs NATO, The policy is to continue the war in order to harm Russia and to, in fact, inflict such damage on Russia that it will never be able to undertake aggression again. That's official US policy, okay? Now let's stop for 30 seconds to think. What does that mean? It means that the war goes on, harms Ukrainians, kills them, reverses the goals of climate change, leads to a threat of nuclear war, causes literally tens of millions of people around the world to face starvation. And we do this in order to harm Russia, okay? Furthermore, let's think for a minute about what it means to harm Russia sufficiently so that it can never carry out an act like this again. Well, does that mean Versailles? No, Versailles was not strong enough. Versailles didn't stop Germany from coming back 10 years later. So it has to be more strong than Versailles. Something like maybe the Morgenthau Plan, which was going to turn Germany into an agricultural country. So that's official US goals. We continue fighting the war until Russia is basically turned back to a peasant society. And what does that mean? It means we fight it endlessly. That's just logic, simple logic if you stop to think for 30 seconds. Well, is that what we want? Or is what we want to reach a negotiated settlement, if that can be achieved, which will be tolerated by both sides? Well, we don't know if it can be achieved. The question is, should we try? The United States says, no, we shouldn't try. We just want to cause the maximum damage, not only to Ukraine, but to the world. Well, what would a possible settlement be? Could be something like what Zelensky outlined in March, this March, and has been on the table for years. Everybody knows what it is. A basic settlement, the outlines are that Ukraine would be neutralized. It would be something like Austria during the Cold War, or say Mexico today. Mexico obviously can't join a hostile Chinese-run military alliance. The country would be vaporized. So something like that, that's one part. Second part is that Crimea would be put off for the moment for later discussion. It's not a topic that can be dealt with now. Zelensky has recognized that, and it's obviously true. The main problem that's left is Donbass. Up until a year or two ago, Russia and the Donbass region had agreed to accept something on the orders of Minsk II, a federal arrangement in which the two main Donbass regions would have considerable autonomy. That would be something like Belgium or Switzerland or other countries, even to an extent like the United States, where the states have a fair degree of autonomy. That would be a basic outline. Now, whether that is still possible after the invasion, nobody knows. There's only one way to find out, that is to try to see if a settlement on that, roughly of that nature, can be achieved. That's where we now stand. Now, NATO is somewhat split on the matter. The United States and Britain, the two warrior states, are clearly, expressly intent on continuing the war until Russia is pretty much destroyed. I don't think that's going to happen, but that you can speculate on that. I think what has happened more likely is Ukrainian destruction. So what the West, that's the US and Britain. The European countries, France, Germany, Italy, have been more tentative. They've made some moves towards negotiation, been stamped down by overwhelming US power. They can continue. What we're now seeing is a ghastly gamble experiment. The experiment is to see whether Russia, Putin, will accept total defeat, slink away in silence with total defeat, or if not, whether he will use the weapons that we all know that he has to devastate Ukraine and set the stage for a possible nuclear war. Well, that's the experiment that the West, led by the US, is insisting on carrying out, with the support of a very wide range of opinion, much of which is so extreme that the Pentagon has to veto it, literally. The Pentagon is the peacekeeping force in the American government. Take a look. You find Congress, people in Congress, people like Hillary Clinton saying, let's have a no-fly zone. What is a no-fly? Pentagon vetoes it because the Pentagon knows what it means. A no-fly zone means you have to have control of the air. To have control of the air, you have to destroy Russian anti-aircraft installations, which are inside Russia. So you have to attack Russia and destroy its anti-aircraft installations and hope that Russia will say, oh, that was nice, or maybe they'll react, in which case we move on to a terminal nuclear war in which we're all destroyed. Well, fortunately, the Pentagon is the last element in the government which has some sanity and vetoes it. But in the current mood, how long are they going to be able to do that? We're facing an extremely dangerous situation. I've had a long life. I have never seen a situation in which totalitarian control was so extreme as it is in the United States right now. It's not to the extent that the Secret Service comes in and arrests me and throws me into jail. No, they don't care. What they do is shut down all means of communication. In the Soviet Union, pre-Gorbachev, citizens were able to access the BBC, the Voice of America, German television. In fact, they got most of their news from there. They didn't believe, nobody believed the Russian propaganda system was too crude and ridiculous. So they were getting their news from the West. We have good evidence about this, not in the United States. In the United States, you're not allowed to hear what Prime Minister Lavrov said. You're not allowed to watch Russian television. No, you have to, if you want to know what the Russian position is, maybe you can pick it up on Indian state television or on Al Jazeera, you know, but that's a degree of censorship that has never existed before. And it's not only outlandish, but it's crazy. Of course you should want to hear what the Russians are saying. I mean, idiotic not to, but it's got to be cut off. And if anyone deviates from the party line, even slightly, like by saying what I'm now seeing now, they're demonized, vilified, fabrications, lies. This incidentally happens in Europe too, in the German, French press, but not to the same extreme as in the United States. Yeah, but this is pretty astonishing. It simply means you cannot produce truisms like what we've been saying. Everything I've been saying is a virtual truism. Takes 30 seconds of thought to see it. There's nothing there that's controversial, but you're not allowed to say it. That's a degree of censorship and control which is unique in a lifetime. Even during the Second World War, it wasn't like this. Now let's talk about the threat of nuclear war. First of all, why did it move to seconds during the Trump administration? Because Trump systematically dismantled the arms control regime, which had been established laboriously over 50, 60 years. He didn't have time to finish it. Biden got in time, just barely in time, hours, to ratify to sign the No START treaty, which Trump was going to destroy. So that's what's left. Apart from we can reconstitute the arms control regime, except that the US Senate will probably not accept it. It's run by Trump worshipers. They will probably not accept it. Well, that's the United States. What else can we do? We can try to alleviate the threats of nuclear war. And it's easy to see what they are. There are many very immediate scenarios that could lead right up the escalation ladder. So let's take one. Right now, Russia has not attacked the supplies lines that are bringing weapons into Ukraine. If that was happening in a war the United States was running, it certainly destroyed the supply lines. Well, Putin hasn't done it, but he might. Suppose he moves on to attack the supply lines. Well, that's coming close to an attack on NATO. NATO's likely to respond. There you go, up the escalation ladder until we're all dead. Or let's take another. One of the effects of the Russian invasion is to block supplies from the Black Sea region, the major source of food, fertilizer, other agricultural supplies. That's leading to massive starvation. Tens of millions of people literally are facing starvation. Well, there are two ways to deal with this. One way is by force an end to the Russian blockade. The other way is by negotiations, by a peaceful settlement that will allow food and fertilizer to end. In the United States, you're not permitted to hear about the second option because that's coming from Russia and you're not allowed to hear it. So you can find out about it by reading the foreign press, something like that. But it's there. Russia has proposed something which at least you can think about, namely a reduction of sanctions to allow Russian ships to carry Russian food and fertilizer out, and also Ukrainian ships and foreign ships. That's one option. Not only can't you consider it, you can't hear it, okay? That's the level of totalitarianism. Well, that's the other option is what the United States is advocating. Send anti-ship missiles, which can be used to sink the Russian fleet. The flagship has already been sunk. Russia didn't react. But we'll send more anti-ship, sophisticated, advanced anti-ship missiles, which maybe can sink the Russian fleet. And Russia will just sit there quietly and say, thank you, we didn't want the fleet anyway. Or maybe they'll react, in which case we're finished. On to terminal war, okay? That's and I can think of many more, so can you. That's the situation we're in. Again, I should say it gets even worse. If you read the Wall Street Journal, what they proposed, their editorial proposed, is that commercial vessels seeking to break the blockade should be accompanied by American warships. They assure us that that's in conformity with international law. So when the world goes up in smoke, we can proudly say we stood up for international law. It's pretty astonishing, but that's the world we're living in. And to even say these things, which are too obvious to discuss, leads to a stream of accusations about you've gone insane, you're a Putin lover, you're Munich, appeasement, and so on. Actually, I should say the appeasement charge kind of amuses me because it's a curiosity, but I'm the last person alive on earth who was able to criticize the Munich Agreement at the time in print, if you count a school newspaper as in print. So comical interlude. But that's what's happening. You can read it in the European press, much worse in the American press.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to move on to our next subject, Palestine. What I found out recently, there was this striking similarity in the media here in Belgium, in France, the UK, United States, of the use of words, of the phrasing, the framing of this recent murder of this Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, which is hardly an exceptional thing. Phrases like "she died during violent incidents," passive sentences. I don't know if that's a grammatical correct term in English. No subject, no hint of suspicion. How do you explain that after all these years, governments and media remain so loyal to this narrative where Israel is portrayed as defensive, sometimes going too far, what then passes as criticism? All this goes on while public opinion has changed dramatically all over the world. How do you assess this state of affairs? Is the Israel lobby, as it is called, really that strong, or is there something else the matter? And what can we do to make the media change their narrative?
Well, what happened with the Shireen Abu Akleh is pretty amazing. Not just the assassination. It's almost, there's some uncertainty, but it's almost certain that it was a careful assassination by a sniper group. But quite apart from that was the attack on the funeral. The funeral procession was attacked by Israeli soldiers. They even attacked the casket. That made news all over the place. It was reported in Israel. You want to know what's going on in Israel? The best source is Haaretz, the main newspaper, pretty open and free. The major correspondent, Gidon Levy, wonderful journalist who reports the West Bank daily, he described it pretty frankly. He said, Israeli stormtroopers attacked, not only killed her, but attacked the funeral procession and even forced the pallbearers to drop the casket. Okay, that's what happened. Well, is that the worst that's going on? No, it's nothing. We're supposed to be concerned about the possibility that Russia might occupy Ukraine. Pretty remote possibility. Are we concerned about the possibility that Israel illegally annexed the Syrian Golan Heights, Greater Jerusalem, in direct violation of Security Council orders, and has carried out brutal, murderous operations in all of the occupied territories, including those illegally annexed, which is where Shireen was killed, in the illegally annexed occupied territories. That's defensive, carrying out an illegal annexation and 50 years of brutal, violent terror, all in violation of Security Council orders. That's defensive. Well, I should say that under Trump, the United States broke from the rest of the world and authorized the illegal annexations. That's Trump. That's the Republican Party today. You want to look at the future? Honestly, take a look at what happened in Hungary last week. Okay, quite important. There was a conference in Hungary of all the far right organizations and factions in Europe, with many with neo-fascist origins. But the star of the meeting was the core of the Republican Party. Hungary is worshipped by the Republican Party. Trump made a speech honoring his great friend, Viktor Orban, who's destroying Hungarian democracy. Tucker Carlson, the leading media figure, made a speech. The Republican, what's called the Conservative Action Congress was the main element and present there. That's the core of the Republican Party. That's what's coming back into office, controlling Congress in November, this November, probably the presidency in 2024, because one of the things they're doing very publicly and actively is trying to undermine American democracy, to prevent voting of people they don't like, to make it either to restore Jim Crow laws, to impose electoral monitors who will throw out election results if they don't like them. All of that's happening quite openly and supported by a very reactionary Supreme Court, most reactionary court. You have to go way back to pre-Civil War days to find something like it. This is not happening in Andorra or Luxembourg. It's happening in the most powerful country in human history, which dominates most of the world. Well, that's what we're facing.
Okay, thank you very much again. Now, the third topic I would like to propose has to do with the recent mass shootings again, this time in Texas. It does look very unlikely that anything substantial will be done to stop the sale of assault weapons in the United States. Yet more than half the population, I don't know the exact numbers, but a substantial part of the population want an end to it. Millions of Americans refuse to have arms in their house. Here in Europe, media focus on the so-called strength of the lobby of the National Rifle Association. There is, of course, in the United States, the history of a colonial settler society, slavery, but also decades of violence, of US foreign policy, police violence, and an electoral system that blocks any political alternative like a social democratic party of some sort. At the same time, while I'm saying that, I do really abhor the many times smug comments here in Europe, as if we do not have our own problems to settle. Yet, it remains a fact that the US is remains exceptional on this issue. What can this really change, and what should be done to change it?
Well, let's start from the current situation and look at how it developed. You can look at this morning's newspaper, New York Times, Washington Post. One of the most prominent Republican senators, John Thune, one of the more reasonable Republicans, I should say, not an avid Trump worshiper, said Americans have to have semi-automatic military rifles in order to shoot prairie dogs. A prairie dog is about this big. It's a little rodent that runs around in the West, practically extinct. But Americans have to have semi-automatic military rifles, repeating, because they have so much fun hunting prairie dogs. That's this morning's newspaper, supported by the Republican Party. all the Republican Party. They're not going to let anything pass because Americans, there was a poll taken about 3 or 4 days ago after the Uvalde massacre, 19 kids and teachers killed. 44% of Republicans, 44% say the United States must tolerate repeated mass murders in order to protect our freedom. Freedom means freedom to run around with a semi-automatic rifle in a marketplace. Okay, that's almost half the Republican Party. Incidentally, after the Uvalde massacre, there have been dozens of others after, okay? The Supreme Court is now, in a couple of weeks, will make a decision, probably suspend a law that goes back to 1913, over a century. In 1913, New York State passed some regulations on concealed carry, meaning carry a weapon concealed. It passed some regulations saying you have to have some authorization for that. Very likely the Supreme Court will overthrow that, meaning that people can run around the United States everywhere, church, school, anywhere, carrying concealed weapons, and they don't need any training, any prior registration, anything. Well, that's the country now. Why is it happening? Well, to see why it's happening, we have to go back to the 19th century. The 19th century, it was a very violent century. The United States was destroying, genocidal destruction of the native population. Well, back when the Constitution was framed, you needed guns for that. In fact, let's go back to the framing of the Constitution. Why was there a Second Amendment in the first place? There were 3 major reasons. One was there was almost no standing army, and the British were a major threat. That was the threat at the time. So you needed a militia to, or in fact, you read the Second Amendment, it starts by saying, in order to preserve a well-organized militia, the right of guns should not be infringed. Reason, the British are coming. Second reason, you had to murder Indians. You had to invade the Indian territories, destroy them, exterminate them, and that required guns for a while. By the mid-century, a more efficient killing machine had replaced the militias, the US cavalry. Now that carried out the job. You didn't need militias anymore. Third reason was slavery. You had to ensure control of the slave population. States like South Carolina, slaves outnumbered whites. There were slave rebellions going on all over the Caribbean. So you needed a well-ordered militia to control the slaves. Well, by the end of the century, none of those things applied. It's important to recognize. And the gun manufacturers were in trouble. The Civil War was over. They lost the market. Europe was in relative peace. They had lost the European market. What are they going to do? They launched the first huge propaganda campaign in history, advertising campaign. It concocted a totally mythical story of a Wild West, the kind we see in movies. Sheriffs fast on the draw, brave cowboys going off to save people, and totally invented. There was nothing remotely like that in history. Cowboys were guys who couldn't get a job, so they pushed cows around. There were no sheriffs. I mean, all the stuff. I believed it when I was a kid, Lone Ranger, Wyatt Earp, really exciting. All totally invented, but it sold. Of course, the punchline at the bottom was your 12-year-old son has to have a modern Winchester rifle. otherwise he won't be a man. So they were able to sell guns. Well, the culture took. As I say, I believed it. I suppose you believed it when we were kids. To this day, people in Europe watch cowboy movies and don't know it's total fantasy, you know, but it sold. Well, then let's go to the next step. Richard Nixon. Nixon understood something very important. The two parties in the United States are both business-run parties, but the Republicans are more extreme. They're the more extreme faction of the one-party state, the business party. And Nixon realized they can't get votes by running on their actual program of support for the very rich and the corporate sector. People don't vote for you on that. So they have to turn to what are now called cultural issues, divert people's attention away from the policies and get them to focus on something else. Well, for Nixon, it was racism. The worst racist laws had been overthrown. The Democrats had been supporting them. So we can win the Southern Democrats over to the Republican Party by portraying ourselves as the racist party. Well, that was pretty successful. By mid-70s, it extended. One of the chief Republican strategists, Paul Weiser, realized that if the Republicans pretended, I stress, pretended to be opposed to abortion, they could win the huge evangelical vote and the Northern Catholic vote. So they all turned on a dime. They had all been what's now called pro-choice, but they suddenly became passionately anti-abortion. Reagan, George H.W. Bush, a whole bunch of them. So now that's a Republican position. You have to be anti, but none of them care at all, but that's the way you get votes. Then came guns. They said another way to get a lot of people is to be in favor of guns. Poor, hardworking Americans, law-abiding Americans have to have their guns. Then the Supreme Court came along, the ultra-reactionary Supreme Court. In 2008, Scalia, writing for the majority, published an opinion which is worth reading. He reversed a century of precedent and said, forget about the business of a well-ordered militia, just drop that. Just keep to everyone has a right to a gun. So he reversed a century of precedent and said, Second Amendment gives everyone a right to have a gun. It's a very interesting decision. He does not mention in it any single one of the reasons why the framers imposed the Second Amendment, none of which had any meaning by the 20th century. Just ignores them, nothing. It's a very learned opinion, all sorts of quotes from the 16th century and so on, but it totally ignores every reason why the Second Amendment was enacted and said, now everybody can have a gun. Well, that turned the Second Amendment into holy writ. You do a poll among Americans today and ask what's in the Constitution. First thing they'll say is the Second Amendment. When Trump tries to mobilize a crowd, first thing he says, you have to defend your Second Amendment rights. It's become a religion. That's why you can get a Republican senator today, this morning, say, we have to have semi-automatic military rifles to shoot prairie dogs. And people don't laugh. It's become a crazed religion. And that's the history, basically.
Okay, that's a very good introduction and historical overview of where we got there today. I would like to link our first topic of Ukraine with my own little country, Belgium. You have already mentioned, you mentioned just now also that the federal system of Belgium, a country like Belgium, might be something to consider as a possible future settlement for Ukraine. Now, there are some similarities. We are two linguistic communities, one speaking the same language as in France, our neighbor to the south, and another part where I live, speaking Dutch, the same language as is our neighbor in the Netherlands. But we should not, I always say we should not overstate it. Belgium is a small country, 11 million people, one of the 6 founding members of the European Economic Community, you know, the predecessor of the EU. Also, I do not want to idealize it, our federal system. It has its shortcomings. I mean, it's complex and at times slows down decision-making, as was proven during the pandemic. It does, however, have one essential quality. Never a shot has been fired over the binational issue. But different as the two different Belgium and Ukraine are, it certainly has some features that might be applicable. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the federal system here, but do you believe that institutional change on a federal model could be the solution for Ukraine? Because personally, I believe that might be part of it, but I also believe that the real underlying solution lies deeper in socio-economic development for all Ukrainians. What do you think about this?
Absolutely, but it's not on the agenda. We have to live with the world as it is, not as we'd like it to be. We can try to improve it, but right now we have an imminent problem. The choices for Ukraine are either permanent war and destruction with everything else for the world, or else some kind of federal arrangement. It's far from ideal. It's far from ideal in Belgium. I can tell you some personal anecdotes. Just a couple of years ago, I was lecturing in the Dutch area, and the guy who organized the lecture is a linguist friend of mine. My wife, former wife, she's died at the time, and his wife were out shopping somewhere during the morning lectures. We were going to meet for lunch. So he went to the desk of the university and asked the secretary there to call a taxi. And we waited, no taxi came, waited, no taxi came. Finally, we came back to her. He came back and asked her, what's the problem? She was desperate. She said she's only allowed to talk Dutch, Flemish, and the taxi drivers are all French. They pretend not to understand. Of course, they all understand, but they pretend not to understand. So there's no way for her to call a taxi. Okay, that's a nuisance, but it's better than killing each other, you know. So for Ukraine, that's the optimal situation at the moment. I don't know if it can be achieved, but it's the best that you can imagine. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, there are much better solutions.
Yes, absolutely. Just as a side remark for Anglo-Saxon people, I would like to remark that there's no such thing as a Flemish language. I know that it's an idea that exists. We do speak Dutch. We do speak Dutch. We might have an accent, you know, like you could call us the Australian version of Dutch. But our final subject is the thing that I mentioned in the beginning. Now, our mutual friend Leopold II and Belgium and its former colony. Now, coincidence has it that 3 hours ago, our King Philippe addressed the Congolese parliament in Kinshasa, what is called a very historical moment in the mainstream media. What he did is he expressed his deepest regrets for the wounds of colonization, but he offered no apologies and no words about what Belgium did after independence in 1960, because Belgium did much more than just colonize. The government and King Baudouin at the time were involved in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. They supported the secession of the Katanga province, going against the UN, by the way, and supported the brutal dictatorship of Mobutu for 30 years. I can tell you that the colonial archives here in Brussels are still inaccessible to the public today. Now, civil society, luckily, is waking up to the importance of decolonization. And in fact, Black Lives Matter and George Floyd raised a much broader awareness on the issue, for example, on the statues of King Leopold, his street names, his plazas in Brussels, Antwerp, Ostend, and other places. For the moment, there's an ongoing debate between those who say take these statues down, and others who say, no, let them be, they're part of our history. Put a plaque or whatever you call it, or something that gives context to these statues. Now, I have two questions for that, and we will wrap up then after that. First of all, where do you stand on this issue? And secondly, is this just a matter of symbolics, or is there more to it?
Well, there's a similar situation in the United States with statues, names of buildings after Confederate generals, utter racist, extreme racists like Woodrow Wilson. My opinion is with those who want to leave the statues. I would say leave the statues with a plaque, or maybe another statue illustrating what actually happened. I think that's the right idea. Let's not erase the history. Let's expose the history so people understand it. And as you said, it's not ancient history. What Belgium did in 1960 is one of the worst crimes of the century. Africa was beginning to decolonize. The most important country in Africa is Congo. Rich country, could be one of the richest countries in the world. Enormous resources and tremendous potential. It had a charismatic leader, young leader, very smart guy. Patrice Lumumba could have led the country forward to develop, to become a major power, could have led all of Africa behind it. Well, the CIA had a contract to kill him, but Belgian intelligence got there first. They killed him. Then they, along with the United States, supported this. First of all, Katanga, then this vicious kleptomaniac, Mobutu, who destroyed the country. By now, millions of people, millions are dying in Eastern Congo, while the multinationals hover over the militias so they can pick up the minerals for your iPhone. That's Belgium. That's what Belgium did in 1960. It's not just this monster Leopold. It's today, right in front of our eyes. Well, I think it should be exposed. In the United States, huge battle about it. We're going to see more of it in November. Censorship is becoming much more extreme in the United States, much more than we've discussed. There's now literal banning of books in libraries. And Trump actually didn't manage to pass it, but he, at the end of his administration, he proposed a federal law to ban teaching in schools of anything that might be divisive or might cause children to feel uncomfortable. That's a code word for teaching anything about American history. Like every history of every country has plenty in it to make people feel uncomfortable. So if you ban that, you're saying nothing but patriotic slogans, okay? We all have to goose step to command and chant patriotic slogans. That's the ideal of the Republican Party, which is taking power. It's already happening in states, Republican-run states. They're banning books from libraries. They're not allowing them to be read in school. Even people like Toni Morrison can't read her in school, you know, but because it makes white kids feel uncomfortable. We're moving towards, what we're moving towards in the United States is a frightening form of a curious kind of totalitarianism where people aren't thrown into jail, like I'm allowed to speak, but with the kind of marginalization and demonization that you can read in the European press, more extreme here, but no gulag, but just what used to be called soft fascism, fascism without the concentration camps, without the extermination camps, but fascism.
Well, well, you managed the matter of banning books. Luckily, people like you still are on it. In fact, there's a new book coming out end of August with Vijay Prashad, with a foreword by Angela Davis, The Withdrawal. Just as a final remark, can you already say something about it?
Yeah, Vijay Prashad is the leading scholar activist on third world issues. He's written brilliantly on them, exposed all sorts of things, travels all over the world, personal experience. He's Indian, but American citizenship. And the two of us have a joint book in which we bring our similar but paired experiences and interests to discuss what we think is happening in the world today, kind of things we've been talking about.
Yes, well, Professor, many thanks for your comments. Is there anything final word that you might want to share with us?
Well, the final word, the World Social Forum just had its 20th anniversary meeting, and they reiterated its slogan from 20 years ago, another world is possible. That's true, it is possible. It's not going to fall into our laps. It's going to take hard work to achieve it, can be done. And if it's not done, we'll all be dead, not in the distant future.
Professor, thank you for these final words. Once again, many thanks, and why not take care. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, bye. Thank you.